Reconsider Christ podcast provides real-life examples on how Christ works to interact with our lives. Our guests paint on the canvas of life their stories of joy, heartache, struggle, and victory. You will learn more about the true nature of Christ, for it is time to reconsider Christ. Tammie Jo Schultz faced intense gender discrimination throughout her career as a Navy fighter jet pilot and a 737 pilot for Southwest Airlines. The discrimination began at career day in high school and continued through Navy recruiters to instructors to other pilots and then managers at Southwest. Yet she is the captain of Flight 1380, whose unique experiences of flying failing aircraft allowed her to do what many would not have been capable of doing. She landed a heavily damaged 737 and saving the lives of 147 people, unfortunately losing one person due to the damage of the fuselage. The path to this moment is an inspiring story of how walking with God will provide the strength for every obstacle and challenge in life. The full details are in Tammie Jo's book, Nerves of Steel. I know you will receive much encouragement from this podcast with Tammie Jo. Well, hello, Tammie Jo. We are so glad to have you today on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Dean, very much for the invitation.
I am excited because it is unbelievable the amount of discrimination, the level and intensity of discrimination that you went through throughout your career as a pioneer and going to new heights that few women had ever been before. And I'm just amazed as I've gotten to know you and reading your book, Nerves of Steel, the way you handled those moments of discrimination, because I would not have passed that test with such flying colors. And you're going to be so encouraging to our audience today.
Well, thank you. I think, it's something that we don't learn all at once, certainly.
That's true. That's true. So what I would like to do to begin with, obviously, there are some critical building blocks in your character that started in childhood and went on throughout your adulthood. And I'd like for just to start in childhood and tell us about the freedom that you had as a child and how you began to build your relationship with God and then that summer camp experience.
Sure. I really grew up in a home that was below poverty level by the world's standards physically, but Mom and Dad served love and laughter with every meal. And I think one of the gifts that they gave me and my siblings was the gift of the innocence of childhood. I think that it was a very uncomplicated childhood, which made it a happy childhood also. But even today, I strove to do the same for my kids. Now, I didn't have a television or a telephone in our home. Right. Growing up, our kids did have such things as well as computers and cell phones. But I think the innocence of childhood is kept by our parents protecting us from the concerns of the world that don't have any business on the shoulders of a child. I didn't ever worry about an invisible virus that I could do nothing about. And the subjects that, wondering what pronoun is appropriate or gender should be chosen, those were topics way too heavy for a child. I think about Corrie ten Boom, and when she first heard about sex sin, and she asked her father, she was a little bitty girl, and she heard the words and wanted to know, what does that mean? And her father, who was a clock maker and repairer, they were traveling together on the train, and he didn't answer her immediately. And when he got ready to get off the train, he gathered his things and asked Corrie to pick up the suitcase and bring it. And she tried, and it was too heavy with tools and things. And he said, it is too heavy. And that's what sex sin is. It's too heavy for you right now. And I know that's a very raw topic maybe out there in our world today, but I think that's a big key to a happy childhood, is having that buoyancy of innocence to build our life on.
Very good. And as you had that state of innocence and the opportunity to enjoy it in the country lifestyle that your family had, one of the things you turned to was reading. And you decided one of the books you were going to start reading was the Bible. Tell us about that.
Right. We, like I said, there wasn't a lot of entertainment other than what you made for yourself. And my mom was an avid, and still is, an avid reader. So we read together. And then whenever we were able to read ourselves, we grabbed everything we could. And the Bible has all these different stories in it. I didn't read it out of piousness or looking for the truth that I could find in it. I read it because it had intrigue, adventure, battles, romance. It just had it all. And so having read the book without an agenda, I think as a child was really helpful, because as I grew up and I started realizing with moonrises and sunsets and baby piglets and calves born, it's pretty easy to see that we're not the intellectual, creative top of the food chain, that there are things that are well beyond the touch of man that happen repeatedly. And somebody had to develop and devise that. So I looked at the different ideas from what I heard at school and what I read in the National Geographic and what I heard at home. And so God just really made sense to me. But it wasn't until I went to church camp, my 8th grade summer going into high school, that I realized him as a redeemer. I had somehow gotten this connotation of a gray-haired, grumpy old guy in the sky just waiting for me to mess up. And when they started unpacking and teaching the book of James, and James 1:5 says, if you lack wisdom, ask me. I will give it in abundance, and I won't resent you for asking for it. And I just thought, this is a God who is speaking to me persuasively, and he's not angry at me. He loves me. He's crazy about me, and he's not asking me to behave and then come to him. He's just saying, believe one simple truth, that I love you, and we'll start from there. And so that honestly was a shift in my universe. And I quit trying so hard to be good and relaxed in the fact that I have a God that loves me, and we'll go through life together, and he's patient and kind. So I would say that would be truly the foundation of why I weathered the storms that I came up against. I don't think I'm the only person that came up against such storms. And I saw in my own dad's life that you don't have to be a woman to be discriminated against. We all go through battles and storms. And to be resilient, I think you have to start in a state of being solid in your foundational thought process and your belief.
That is very true. And I appreciate some of the upcoming verses I know that are very important in your life to kind of show that continued growth. So at one of the farm ranches that you lived at during your childhood, you were close to an air base. You saw those jets flying over. You began to think, that's what I want to do. And so career day, senior year in high school, tell us about it.
I had seen the jets overhead, you're right. And that had really whetted my appetite. I read Jungle Pilot, which is the story of Nate Saint, incredible aviator and man of faith. And so I was putting all those puzzle pieces together of what I'd seen and what I'd read. And now I was going to have my chance to meet a real pilot and get some guidance into how to get into this field. And when I arrived, his first question was, are you lost? And I said, no, sir, I signed up for aviation. And he just shook his head. He said, this is career day, not hobby day. You need to go find something, girl. And I took the closest empty seat, not out of defiance or courage. I just had nowhere else to go. It wasn't my school. The buses were locked. And I thought, even if I can't do it, I'd sure like to listen to it. And as I left, I was really confused, because coming from a farm and ranch work needs a workforce. So if you could do it, you're always welcome to try it a few times. And I just wondered why girls didn't do it, why it wasn't even an option. But I am a practical person at the end of the day, and I decided, well, I don't need any more hobbies. I need a job. I need a vocation, a profession. And I headed off to school and studied something completely different.
And yet, even though I believe it was veterinarian field that you went to, which would be a natural progression of your life from the farm and your love of animals. And at some point, though, you began to realize, I've got to get back to my passion. When did that transition happen where you said, you know, I'm not going to be a veterinarian, I'm going to be an aviator?
Well, it was, I would have to say economics drives things. Sometimes we resent it, and yet it was truly economics that drove my decisions from there into the Navy. I met a pilot as I was getting ready to leave college. I'd already realized I didn't have the money to continue on for the veterinary training. I got my pre-med split with agribusiness, but I did not think I could continue paying for more schooling. And I met another pilot. This one was a woman. She was getting her wings in the Air Force. And I thought, okay, what I thought was a wall was probably just a really wide door, and there's hinges on it somewhere because she got through. And I started looking into it again. I'd already graduated from college when I was going to the recruiters and looking for a place that I could put my application in. I had my 4-year degree, which was required, but the Air Force said, no, we don't recruit girls for this. The Army said, you're not a fit. And during that time, I'm interviewing for jobs in my field and I'm not getting any. And so I kept trying, and the Navy did say, oh, just take a test. Now, what happened was I took the test, but it took me 2 more years and 3 more recruiters to find one that would actually process that test. And then I had my way in to naval aviation through boot camp. But if I could have paid for lessons, I would have done that whenever I kept being told no. So I want to encourage whoever's listening that sometimes those economic nudges one way or the other can be a blessing. They can put us on the path we need to be.
And what's going on with you and God during this time? Because as you said, that was, you go to a 4-year college, and then you have another 2-year plus process before you actually get in. So you have the career day guy who says, this is not a hobby. You have a recruiter who says, yeah, you didn't score enough for a woman. And now you're thinking there's a different score for men and women. And why did you keep going? And what's going on with you and God?
That would be probably a little bit of the desert time. I knew that I had a gift that so many of my peers in rural New Mexico didn't have, and that was a college education. No one in my family had gotten a college degree before, and I felt like I was the only one with a degree and the only one without a real job. So it was a pretty humbling time, but it also was a time when I had a chance to, number one, reestablish just a friendship with my younger brother who went to first grade when I went to college. So we hadn't seen much of each other. And right. So that was certainly a lifelong blessing. I also look back with the advantage of time now and realize that 2-year time frame of me kind of beating my head against what seemed like a brick wall, that was a waiting period that absolutely put me in a very different place in aviation, military aviation in history. Because first of all, I would have never met my husband if I had gotten in when I wanted to. I would have gotten into the Air Force, not the Navy. And the Navy was the only one during my time in the military that allowed women to fly combat aircraft in tactical missions. We weren't allowed by Congress yet to fly in combat squadrons, but we flew A7s, F-18s, and we did them in tactical missions. We studied French, Russian, and Chinese weapons and tactics, and then we simulated the enemy against Top Gun students, individual ships, carrier groups, and squadrons. So that holding cell that I felt like I was in, it put me right where I needed to be, And at that time in history, I was in the first group of two ladies that flew the F-18, and that would not have been open to me. So to encourage those that feel like they're in a bit of a desert and just in a holding pattern, so to speak, in aviation, it was one of the biggest gifts God gave me were the closed doors and the waiting time.
And, you know, perspective is so beautiful because obviously as you look back and you see how you slotted into those time periods, you know, that it worked out for you. But during that time, what encouraged you and kept you resilient that you would call the second recruiter and then finally the third recruiter before he had actually turned in your test and your package?
You know, I don't know if I've morphed this into my own version, but Isaiah 50 verse 7 was probably one of my mantra verses then. And that was, therefore I will not be dismayed. I have set my face like flint to do your will, and I will not be ashamed. And that's a loose translation, but I couldn't help but feel that, first of all, whatever God had for me, he has great plans for all of us. Ephesians 2:10, he talks about, you are his poema. He has created each of us on purpose, brown eyes, brown hair, whatever you have, on purpose, by hand, and with a purpose, already preparing the good works he's got planned. And I think about the things that we plan for our children and how exciting it is to see them enjoy that. And I was confident that I had a God that hadn't forgotten me in nowhere, New Mexico, that I did have a purpose in this life. I didn't know what it was yet because it seemed like my idea was not coming to any fruition. But I went back to grad school in that time. And I remember thinking, I'm got to move on. It was something that I thought was just built for me, but someday maybe I'll have enough income to have disposable and have aviation as a hobby. But as I was at grad school and getting my teaching credentials and a graduate degree, I just kept getting bugged by this. I really would like to just get into the military to fly. And I've always wanted to serve my country. I just didn't know what girls did to serve their country exactly that I would be good at. And I remember just coming to that point where I thought, okay, Lord, I'm going to try one more time. I'm going to take the test one more time, and then I'm done, and I will never revisit it. And I just ask that you go before me and bless my ability to take this test. I prayed over that test so much. And then I contacted the recruiter. It was a different recruiter. And the only reason it was a different recruiter is because I continued on in life. I didn't sit and just quietly wait and expect God to bring it to my doorstep. I thought, okay, I'm not getting in. I'm going to go get my teaching credentials and get something that is marketable at this time in the economy. And because I had gone to Silver City, New Mexico, and I was going to be going through Albuquerque, I contacted a different recruiter. And he called me back and he said, well, what was your test score? And I said, oh, I don't know. They just told me it was good enough for a guy, but not for a girl. And he just started laughing. He said, we don't have different levels of guys and girl test scores. And he said, just what's your social? And I gave him my social security number. He looked it up. He goes, oh, your test scores are great. Let's just pick a date to come in and get the paperwork done. And so, just kind of odd stepping along the way, but that football adage of keep your feet moving when you feel like a door is shut. It may be for a time and it may be for a season, but there's a reason God puts a draw in our hearts, I believe, for certain things, and that we are talented in those areas.
That is great stuff. It shows a great godly perspective and your confidence and faith in him and how the process worked out in the way that he wanted. And it also states something that I see, throughout the book, this growing confidence that you have, because you have to kind of quote it to yourself, throughout your career. I am meant to be here. I am an aviator. God
Right.
wants me to do this. Where did that come from?
I think part of it is just what you're interested in first. And like I said, I hadn't flown, so it wasn't that I grew up, around airplanes or anything like that. But I think part of it is just the same reason that you don't drop out of junior high when you become unpopular. It's bound to happen. Just keep moving, And the things that they listed as attributes or characteristics needed to fly, I felt like I filled the bill. Hand-eye coordination and certain physical ability. I did track and volleyball and cheerleading in college, and so I'd always enjoyed the physical aspect of life, and I liked the challenge, both mentally and physically, that it produced or that it presented, and I did have a patriotic stirring that made me want to do something like that, and that's really, to put it into tangible words. It was the cupcake that looked good.
Yeah, very well said. And another thing that I noticed as I saw this confidence that you had in God and where he was leading you and the talents and abilities that you had that were unique to you, is that like in your formation training, and people can read about that in the book. And the first time early in your flight training where the instructor the day before had done a barrel roll into the landing pattern. Then the next day told you to go into the landing pattern, and you did the same barrel roll that he had done. Obviously, because you have an art. You understand the art of flying. Your instructor talked about how you came into the formations in such a unique and beautiful way, not exactly by the book, but in just an art form. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think, every industry, every profession, every occupation has your signature to it. And just as there are things that are kind of innate in my ability in aviation, someone else has a different facet that's just as fascinating, that they have just an innate ability to understand, manipulate, or reproduce that. And so I would say when I first started flying in the Navy, and they sent me home with a stack of books that were, I'd say, probably at least 40 or 50 pounds of copied literature, that they said, just, this is what you'll need to learn. And I went to my BOQ room, shut the door, and just started crying and thought, Lord, I can't memorize this much. I don't understand. Even most of it reads like Greek to me. And then I just thought, God only expects of us what he's equipped us to do. So I'm only expected to do my best. The guys that I would run with every night, we'd gone through boot camp, some of us together, and so they were in the same place I was. But some of them had flown before, and a lot of them had come from military families. And so some of this jargon and was just second nature to them. And they seemed so at ease with it all that I just thought, well, I will say, I've worked so hard to get here to this point that they will have to just take me and throw me out of the gate and say, you can't come back in. I'm not leaving just because I'm not really good at it. I am going to stick to this. And I think that's sometimes when God shines the brightest in our lives, when we do finally put our hands up and just go, I can't do it. I can't wrap my mind around all of this. And that's when Christ has a chance to show he is so much bigger and bolder than what we have expected him to be. And so I learned one subject, one flight at a time, and wound up doing very well in the flight program in the Navy.
Mm-hmm. And eventually became one of the most recognized pilots in the world. So it all works out.
Oh.
Now, real quick, I have to ask, there's a rumor that even Maverick couldn't shoot you down at Top Gun.
I will say that Top Gun called our squadron for bogeys or bandits.
Yeah.
We were north of Malibu or in Lemoore, and they were in San Diego at the time. It's moved now, but so the instructors would call and tell us what the mission was. And sometimes they'd say, we don't even want to know what the mission is. We don't even want to know how many bogeys or bandits you're sending. We're going to be in this whiskey area, which is a lat long over the ocean, and do your best. And so we would go in. We had one of the things that was, I felt like always really fun, was the Russian bear and MiG simulation. The Russians would often send their big patrol prop called a bear along the coastlines, and they don't look that threatening, but obviously they're showing we have a presence. But often they would have MiGs tucked in under the wings, so there was no radar image of anything but one big aircraft. And then they go scorching through the little villages or towns to kind of flex their muscle more. Right. And so understanding how to recognize and act against such a threat was one of the things that Top Gun often ordered.
I think what you're just talking about there, Tammie Jo, your experience with Top Gun, that was fun, and that was part of your professional experience. And so, sometimes people think, oh, the discrimination was hard and heavy and onerous, day after day after day, but there's some, it's spread out. There are some sweet seasons in between, and you're with different bases and different commanding officers. And one of those sweet seasons we'll talk about, and then we'll go heavy into the dark side of the discrimination scenes, is your, I believe it's your solo flight, and several of you were going to take it together, and some Yahoo had a cabin somewhere in New Mexico that was going to be wonderfully blanketed in snow, and all of you were going to go, and then all of a sudden circumstances happened to be what?
Well, it was actually when I was instructing, and it was going to be a 4-plane formation.
That's right.
Yeah. A student in each aircraft.
Yes.
Students are required to do these cross-country flights so that they learn how to navigate outside the general area, talk to controllers everywhere, and be ready for things that are not anticipated. When you fly, in the South Texas area, you could almost name the controllers. We all get so familiar, but getting a cross-country experience is just part of learning how to navigate all aviation. And so that was the plan. The student who contacted me was not my student, but he couldn't find an instructor. His 3 roommates had all found instructors, but it was his dad's place up in Ruidoso, New Mexico that we were going to stay at. So he was really trying to find an instructor and found out that I was from that part of New Mexico. So he called me and I said, sure, if I have a place to stay, the Navy doesn't pay for us to have a place to stay. And he said, oh, you've got your own bed and bath in the house, and, everything's set. And so I made sure he had all the flights that he needed to be qualified, and everything was a go. The night before, I got a call from one instructor after another instructor that either their student was med down, wasn't prepared with their previously required flights, or something, until it was just me and this student going to Ruidosa, staying in a house over the weekend alone. And I mean, we were going to be skiing the whole time, but I remember calling my folks thinking, they're such prudes. I'm sure they'll guide me to the most conservative idea here. And they listened, and they were both on the phone. We didn't have two phones, but they were sharing the receiver. And they said, Tammie Jo, you like to fly, you like to ski. You're the only girl in the squadron. You're going to always be the only girl on the trip. I don't really get it. And I went, okay, if my folks think it's fine, I'm going. And that was Dean Schultz 34 years ago. And having that time flying and then driving up the mountain skiing, we realized that both of us were not just church attenders, that we had a personal walk with Christ. And so that kind of began a very slow courtship that sped up once he left the squadron and was not my student ability anymore.
Mm-hmm. And to tie a bow around that, of course, there's a happy ending of the two of you getting married, but you're both still in the Navy. And literally the first couple of years, you're not seeing each other very often, and you're certainly not living together because you're at different bases. Talk about the struggle there and how God was helpful to that.
Yes, I will say it wasn't anything both that we enjoyed being apart, but it can also, we called it the accelerator, the Navy accelerator. And that is, long distance relationships, they will accelerate which direction the relationship is headed, whether you become closer and tighter, or whether you head to going different ways. And being apart, I think, kept both of us pretty close on our knees, just out of wanting to be together, not being together. So having that time that you would normally fill with your spouse, you fill it with someone you love. And so I think that certainly kept us both in God's word, but it makes you appreciate, I think it made me appreciate even more the time that we had together. And one of the things that we did is when we were together, whatever we did together. So if it was dove season, we both went dove hunting. If we were going to see Phantom of the Opera, we both went to see Phantom of the Opera. And having that beginning of a marriage that you really try to take advantage of your time together. And so it was a bit of a training program in that aspect.
Oh, unbelievably so, I'm sure. So unfortunately, there were guys in the Navy who did not think that women should be flying. And the higher you went in aircraft, the more adamant that became at times. And obviously, I want to represent everybody. There were great times in your career and you thoroughly enjoyed it. But there were, 2 or 3 guys in the Air Force, and then 2 or 3 guys after your successful career there at Southwest that were just bent on your failure.
Right.
So I don't know if you want to talk about Black Sox or Ops O, which one of those code names you want to talk about, but just give us a sense of the intensity of the discrimination, and then how you could stand there and take it and move forward. Unbelievable.
Well, I think, like you said, first of all, I flew with consummate aviators and prince among men. But when there was weak leadership, then the gremlins came out. And as long as there was a good and strong leader that just kept the focus on the mission, I think of Fred Grant, my commanding skipper in T2s. I just never had a moment's worry about any fiefdom or stepping on any toes about being a female. Nobody cared. We all just focused on flying. But the minute there was a change of command and there was a new commanding officer who made it very public and overt, he would not have a woman teaching guns in his aircraft, in his squadron, in his Navy, And the minute he did that, it was open season on me. And so I realized, leadership will always set the tone. And those that acted out in a completely ungentlemanly, even unethical way, they were doing it on their own. They certainly weren't supported by the Navy. The Navy's too big for such smallness. But without good leadership, there's no buffering. So I had one particular, we'll call him Black Sox, that he was an instructor in the A7, and he had always made it very evident he was not approving of me being there. And when we briefed for an hour and a half, he never looked at me. When we debriefed for an hour after the flight, he never looked at me. And then we were on a detachment down in El Centro and bringing the aircraft back home. I'd flown maybe 7 hours total in the aircraft. I'd had some instrument practice in the simulator, but he decided that we needed to go launch, even though there was a big storm and the field was shut down in Lemoore. Bottom line is, after orbiting in a holding pattern for a long time, I lost my instruments. The A7 was a very old Vietnam.
May I interrupt here? Because people are going to understand this situation here. You're in the big, huge thunderstorm.
Right.
You have lost your instrumentation, except for a very few dials. Your Black Sox guy sees an opportunity to denigrate you and perhaps disqualify you if you wreck the plane on the landing. So, and you're having a circle, and it's so bad, he can't even keep it on course. Take it from there.
we had 100-mile-an-hour winds.
Yeah.
That were hard to stay within the holding pattern. And he was the lead. Whenever my instruments went out, I passed the lead on to him. Right. And he couldn't stay in it. Not anything against him. It was pretty tough. And the A7 has very rudimentary instruments to keep in a holding pattern anyway. But as we come down through 30,000 feet of tight formation, flying in very thick clouds, so you're tucked in very tight. And as a wingman, your scan is in 2 or 3 different points, and you're just constantly keeping your distance. You're not looking at your own scan. Now, I don't have a heads-up display because that was a repeat of my instruments, which had failed. So I had 2 small standby instruments, and both of them clouded by age, so they're very hard to read. And when you're flying formation, it can be very vertigo is just so near whenever you go from flying tight formation, especially in the GU where you don't have any reference to a horizon. And then the lead, he checked into approach and he jinked away. So now I am just left with a blank in front of me and trying to get some kind of a scan going together. I have an altimeter that's about this big around by my knee. Yeah. And I just have to tell the approach controller, I need a controlled approach. And they told me stop, turn, start, turn, increase descent, decrease descent. I mean, I'm just literally, I could have shut my eyes to fly because I had so little information. And truthfully, your idea of his intentions were probably white-coated, sugar-coated, because that's a recipe for a crash, not a bad landing. And had my hook down because A7s are squirrely on a wet runway. They have very close-in tricycle gear. So had my hook down, it happened to skip, which that happens too. And I went off into the mud. He later just did everything he could to sell me down the river, saying I was the one getting thrown out of the pattern. It was just one of those classic things where we have to step back and say, Lord, I'm going to stick with the truth, and truth outlives a lie. And Dean was gone on a detachment. I didn't have anybody at home. I had the Lord and my parents to rely on for some strength to go through storms. And there's been others since, but the recipe is always the same. Poor leadership equals others acting out. People are flawed, and some will carry out their ways on others. I often found that the men that I enjoyed flying with, they enjoyed flying and were confident in their own abilities in and out of the cockpit. The men who felt like they needed to defend their territory were often threatened because their own abilities were threatened, but not by me.
Yes, yes. And you're right. I want our audience to understand that these levels of discrimination, and there was another time when you were put at physical risk also on the 9th formation, that there was extreme verbal, emotional, and actually physical danger involved in the discrimination that you faced at times. And so, you go, hey, God, what are we doing here? And so, and what answer did he give you when you were back at your place and realized what all had happened that time, and then the other times of discrimination? Why did you just keep going forward?
Well, I can't help but think about all those early Bible stories where the hero or the heroine absolutely faced one gauntlet after another, it seemed like. And I think there's a reason. The Psalms often cries out. I think about Psalm 35:1, fight against those who fight against me. Rise up with sword and buckler. I mean, there's a reason God had that recorded so that he could see he's got an ear for not just our praise, not just our worship and our gratitude, but he is the God that we take the bad stuff to as well. And then I would my eyes would seem to always land on that 2 Timothy 1:7. Mm-hmm. I did not give you a spirit of fear, or timio, which translated means fear. I did not give you a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power, love, and self-control. And so I sometimes just had to take God at his word and say, all right, I'm going to study what I need to for tomorrow, and you've got it, because I don't think I do.
Well, and that was one of the keys I saw several times in the book, that you could literally let go of it, and it didn't stack up on your shoulder, the times, and you were able to trust God and have that spirit of power and self-control, and just amazing. So, you leave the Navy and have some great experiences that we'll save for people to read in the book with firefighting. And then all of a sudden you have an opportunity to perhaps fly for Southwest. There's a connection. Somebody says, call so-and-so. And so you start that process. You go to training and walk down in the lobby one morning, thought you were about to get your commercial certifications, and you found out differently.
Well, that was such a convoluted path to getting my 737 type rating, and the company that I was getting mine with, we'd all gone to Phoenix to use the simulators there to get my 737 type rating in a simulator. And whenever I came down, I found that the entire class had left the day before and gone to LA to use the simulators in LA. And the owners, the instructors, nobody even called me. So I made a phone call to confirm what the bellman had told me. And they said, yeah. I was a little incredulous. I said, why didn't somebody tell me that we were relocating and let me check out of the hotel with everyone else and get back there and get in line? And they said, you're a woman, you don't need a job. And it would take me a little while and some good debate to persuade them that I've already paid my $9,000 for a type rating. I am in the queue before these guys. And they had people in classes behind me finishing ahead of me because I was a woman. And so, there's just those little things that kind of, they either tear you down or they gird you up. And I felt like it was probably part of the forging process of realizing where God sends you, where God puts you, and the talents that he's given you, it's not always going to be open doors and blessings. There's often, we do have to fight our way in.
Yes, yes. And then you get to Southwest during the height of their culture and free spirit of the movement back then that Herb Keller had. And I'm sitting there reading the book. I say, okay, I knew better because my wife had already told me. It just keeps going all the way through the book. And I think she's at Southwest now. It's love. It's a new spirit. It's going to be great. They're going to have babies. Life's wonderful. Tell us.
Right. When I left the Navy, there was such a kind of a bubbling battle going on. And it was simply because of the changes. Anytime change happens, whether it's at our kitchen table or in the Navy, in the nation, change always brings up, both sides feel like it's their last chance to get in a good word. And so with the combat exclusion policy lifting, there were those that felt like they really needed to let it be seen and understood that women can possibly do this. And so I happened to be in a year group that was the cutoff. Everybody in the year group after me was welcome to go on into a fleet squadron. They offered me other administrative things, but they would not be flying in a combat squadron. And I thought, I've done what I could and more in the Navy than I ever thought I could, and I'm headed out to do something different. I flew over forest fires with one of the funnest group of people I've ever flown with, and then got on with Southwest Airlines. They are a great company. The esprit de corps is real, it's good. But again, if there's ever an area with management that's not got oversight and you happen to get a bad manager in there, then they act on their own impulses. And there was someone that came from the Navy that had, I think, been asked to leave the Navy early because of some of his presence in tailhook, which was another big scandal that had broken out about the same time.
Right.
All of commercial aviation was being introduced to this idea that the captain is no longer king with no Magna Carta. The captain is a part of the crew, and crew resource management had come onto the scene. And so, there was a little mini culture war even within commercial aviation. And aviation is a small enough community that the lifting of the combat policy for women aviators was talked about, I think, in every cockpit on every flight that I was on my first year or two. And then tailhook and the feeling that some had gotten falsely slandered about being there and their part in it. And that had come about by a female Navy pilot who had been attacked by a group of aviators and speaking up about it. So in that brouhaha is when I came into Southwest Airlines hoping for peace and happiness. And there were a few, I would say a chief pilot and assistant chief pilot who had been buddies through the Air Force for years and had a very anti-woman approach. I find out decades later that they had made a mission of firing female pilots. And since I flew something with a pointy nose and an afterburner, that was especially threatening to them, although all of us were there flying what we wanted to fly in life, 737s. So it did lead to me being terminated, not because of anything I'd done on the flight line, anything I had said. It was because of rumors that they thought they could make stick about crashing an A7 in the Navy. And so it took it took an official hearing at the headquarters of Southwest, and the Navy stepped forward and just said, this is a false accusation. Here's the safety teams, the international safety teams write up on it. And then my skipper flew in from that time, and Dean's commanding officer also flew in to testify on my behalf. And those that had accused me that did show up were forced to recant their statements, and I got my job back. I can't say it was all pretty after that, because a lot of people chose to believe what they chose to believe.
Yeah. And the A7 reference is back to that time when the guy had abandoned you and you'd slid off the runway, and the hearing rulings were that due to the aircraft and the weather that you were not at fault. And some guy had flippantly said something one day when he saw you on the tarmac or whatever to his captain that said, I saw her wreck a plane and I feel unsafe.
Right.
You know, and then these two villains get a hold of it, and between them and your union rep who didn't really come to rescue for you, you get fired. You have 6 months of wandering around, I think it was, figuring out what you're going to do. Your female commanding officer in your previous Navy experience said truth will outlive the lie. And so you hired the lawyers and went back and got your job, and you were flying again. So,
well, I would have to say I didn't hire lawyers. I had amazing people that were supposed to just point me to who I would talk to. But Dean and I, we were just out of the Navy, brand new at Southwest. We had no money. And there were two amazing ladies that stepped up and just said, you know what, we'll take it.
That's right. You say that in the book. The lawyers went pro bono for you.
Susan Barnes,
Yeah.
Amazing women. And they did it knowing that my goal wasn't to get money. My goal was to get back into flying and be left alone, which would leave them with no, recompense for all their time and energy. So
Exactly.
God's some neat champions in my path.
Yeah. So we'll go to 1380 here in a moment, but tell me now, you've been through all this, you've been fired, you've been publicly and professionally humiliated by these rumors and false accusations. You're back in the cockpit now. What's going on with you and God?
Oh, I don't know how to put it in one solid statement, but I would just say one of the things that came out of that is I don't call myself a fighter pilot, an attack pilot, a 737 pilot. That's what I do. And I'm blessed to have done it. I enjoyed it. I still enjoy flying. And, but God made me realize we do have to transcend what our job on earth is. And that I know there's a couple of lessons. You may have one in mind, but I just remember relying on God and realizing our timing is not always his timing. And one of the advices that Captain Rosemary Mariner gave me was go 5 years down the road and look back, 10 years and look back. What decision now would be a good one? Because I wasn't sure I wanted to come back when they offered me my job.
Right.
But I have to say God was so good about keeping my head above the water. And about the time I thought, I can't stay above these waves. I don't know how to battle this. And I'm tired of fighting just for the right to do what I've spent years learning how to do and am very capable of. And about the time I would give up, someone would say something or point me to a scripture or a story in the Bible where, God's person that he's put there is struggling for a long time, but God's never late.
Yeah, he's late all the time, according to our timetables. Not his, that's for sure. Okay, so there was a time when you were an instructor that your job was to take pilots, students up into the air and stall the plane, a perfectly flying plane, and stall it at various angles and ways so that they could get over the nerves of, falling free through space, bring a huge instrument back into control and fly away. And you would do this with them time after time after time. One day, because of some mechanical failures on the plane, your student puts it into the stall, you start to dive, and all of a sudden you're basically going straight down in a spiral, which the plane's not even supposed to be able to do.
Right.
Obviously, you take control of the plane again, and you've got a deck, and it's at 5,000 feet. At 5,000 feet, you guys have to decide, are we going to get this plane out, or are we going to eject? And you're thinking, I have a wedding upcoming. I cannot eject because of the bruising and lacerations on my face. And the student pilot is screaming altitude to you, 12,000, 11,000, 10,000. You're talking to God going, is this it? Is this how it's going to happen? And at 5,000 feet, out of frustration, you slam the left rudder, slam the right rudder, slam the left rudder, and all of a sudden the plane stabilizes somewhat, I guess, and you don't hit the ground.
Right. I would have to say that was a little earlier than 5 because we had to be under control at 5 or eject. And so even though we were nose straight down and at max airspeed for the T2, I think terminal velocity, we were at least in control by 5,000 and could pull it up before terra firma contact. And yes, and then we went on. So we didn't have even procedures to get out of that. And I have to say, those are one of those moments in time when you just think God gives us inspiration well outside of our own, quiver of arrows or toolbox, because that was just something I didn't want for either one of us, the student or myself, to eject. But yes, I did have adrenaline pumping through my mind so I could think about a lot of things before that happened. And my wedding coming up was one of them.
But I think, that obviously all your training, all your hours, and all these variety of planes, and then that time, the time you were socked in and abandoned, you'd been in horrifying times inside a plane, and yet it demanded that you continue to think and you continue to process. So you leave New York, the first officer is flying the plane that day, everything's going splendid until it starts shuddering. And the one thing I didn't understand until I read the book, because obviously in all the news reporting, they didn't go into this. It almost felt in the news reporting, there was a lot of things going on behind you, but it was quiet in the cockpit because y'all were separated, a cup of coffee, we're flying this thing, it's a little bumpy, but we just bring it on into Philadelphia and everybody cheers. And then I'm reading the book and I'm going, oh my gosh, it's chaos, just literal chaos. And then you're having to figure out, calculus and geometry and aerodynamics and, your poor first officers over there going through 8 manuals, looking through checklists, trying to figure out how do we land and the flaps and computing things. And you're sitting there talking to God. Walk me through all that. Did I describe that well enough?
There was no onset of vibrations or anything like that. It was just suddenly an explosion, and we just skidded sideways, pitched over in a dive, and did a snap roll to the left. And Darren and I, later comparing notes, assumed that we'd been hit by another aircraft. What else could make punch you in the sky like that? And then getting control of that, leveling the wings, and getting through the smoke-filled cockpits, the roar that we couldn't communicate over. Also just not being able to breathe, all those things, and the aircraft almost flipping over at one time. You know, those things can be a little unsettling. And so it took us a few moments to get our oxygen masks on and be able to communicate, and then figure out where we can point our nose to get started that direction. That's one of the things that all pilots learn. When you have an emergency, you still have to maintain situational awareness as well as aircraft control. And so realizing now we need to land somewhere and it needs to be within our reach. Now, Boeing makes such a great aircraft that you can fly with a single engine the entire flight if you needed to. But we'd had an exposed single engine failure, which means the explosion had torn up that engine, the cowling, part of the wing, tail, the side of the aircraft had a lot of damage. Most of it, I think, would center around that missing window, but that was on the fuselage. But those things are just you know, all in the problem solving now of getting to an airport that with a drag ratio that you have never figured on. You know, there's no 5-to-1 or 2-to-1. It's a drag ratio that, quite frankly, never settled down because there was always a tearing of metal going on, or composites that was going on. So we never had the exact same rudder input. Of course, we were changing airspeeds to try to find an airspeed that was provided a little less shuddering, and then getting down and always making a turn into the damaged engine to get to Philadelphia was tricky. But at that first, I'll back up and just say, at that first moment of chaos, when we did have control of the aircraft, but the cockpit had filled with condensation and with smoke from the exploded engine just coming in through the air conditioning system. There was a point where there was really nothing that I could look at to help give me any information. And adrenaline gives you this rush of being able to think very quickly. And so I remember thinking, okay, this may be the day I meet my maker. And rushing with that towards those cliffs of what if, and if that's the case. And when I thought that thought, I would have to say that I did just stop that train, get off, and take a step back from that precipice and realize I won't meet a stranger. And I think that's really where that calm that Jesus promises us, that he will give us a calm beyond comprehension, beyond understanding. And I mentally turned around to face the flying part of the flight. And Darren and I got busy with what we could. I made an announcement as soon as we had things under control and we're headed towards Philadelphia, because I thought it was a bit startling up here. I can't imagine being in the back and not knowing what happened, what we're doing. And we'd fallen, you know, pretty quickly. It was a pretty steep dive there at first. So I knew that just a word from the cockpit would tell them, you know, that we are still in control of it. We're still here and where we're going. Destinations can bring such a comfort and such a hope to our lives. And I think about how that translates eternally as well.
Exactly. And then, of course, you had to make a right turn eventually into the airport, which again took some calculations and trying to figure out airspeed, because there was a dynamic. You can't turn right by powering because you're dragging the left then. And so you have to power down on the right, which went against your instinct. And yet you would lose altitude, I think, also at the same time, but to bring that plane around and then head in. And then, you know, to hear the confidence that you had because of your faith in God, you dealt with the worst scenario very quickly. I may die. Okay, let's fly this plane. You know, let's get going here and see what we get done. You get on the ground. You actually say a prayer out loud, I believe, or, that even Darren heard. And then eventually the people are off the plane. You're on the plane by yourself, looking at the carnage back in the passenger area. And what are you and God doing at that time?
Well, I would have to say there is a calm that God gives us. Sometimes the more intense the situation, the more calm he makes us, because we do need to be able to think clearly, prioritize, reprioritize. And so honestly, at that point, I was incredibly grateful that we had gotten on the ground. The last couple of miles, even approaching the runway, were not given that we'd make the runway. We had so much drag. I had all the power in that I could control with the rudder, because once you have more power than you can overcompensate with the rudder, then the aircraft starts listing sideways, and that's incredible drag, and you'll just sink even faster. So there was certainly a play on just how much airspeed can we lose and still maintain control, because that's what gives us control with our rudders and ailerons. And with that much damage on the wing and the rest of the aircraft, we didn't know at what airspeed we wouldn't have control. So making that touchdown, I know on the cockpit voice recorder, it records me kind of whispering to myself, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Lord." But incredibly grateful that God would give us a safe landing, and there was a loss of life, and Jennifer Reardon's loss will never be eclipsed by the survival of the rest of the aircraft. There is a family that grieves for her, and it weighs heavy on all of our hearts. But at the end of the day, my husband reminded me, there may be conflict in this day between rejoicing that you could make the runway, not a given, till we touch down, and the loss that happened in the day as well. And Ecclesiastes verse that says there's a time to laugh and a time to weep, a time to mourn and a time to dance. And I went to bed that night thinking, I don't know that I ever understood those words before. I've heard them since I was a little girl, but that day they definitely made a deeper sense than it ever made before.
Well, an amazing story. The years that you fought through the discrimination, the years of training and preparation, your service, and then your career with Southwest are truly, I hope, encouraging to people to see how God can work in our lives and how that discrimination can be fought through in a professional and godly way. You're just such a great example of that, Tammie Jo. Tammie Jo, thank you so much. Such an inspiration today, and I appreciate your time. And I know our audience is just going to love listening to this story.
Well, thank you, Gene. It was a joy to get together with you.